Fear almost never arrives loudly. It doesn't burst through the door or shout its intentions. Fear doesn't need drama. Fear prefers suggestion. It leans in close and asks a question that sounds harmless at first. Doesn't that seem strange to you? You start noticing symbols carved into a building that you've passed by 100 times before. You hear about a meeting that you weren't invited to. Someone mentions a group that exists quietly, privately, and without explanation. And your brain does what it always has done best. It starts filling in the gaps. Not with facts, but with meaning. Because humans are exceptional pattern makers. It's the reason we've survived long enough to build civilizations. Our ancestors noticed rustling grass before they saw the teeth. They connected dots quickly, sometimes instinctively, because hesitation was fatal. But that same skill that kept us alive also betrays us when the threat isn't a predator, it's just uncertainty. When something is hidden, sworn, or gated, our minds don't leave that space blank. We don't tolerate empty explanations very well. We draw something there instead. And whatever we imagine is almost always going to be bigger, more intentional, and more dangerous than reality. That is where secret societies live. Not just in history, but very deeply in our heads. So today, we're going to be talking about those secret societies, the Illuminati, the Freemasons, and the long human habit of deciding that if we don't understand how power works, it must be working against us. And here's the naked truth right up front, because most secret societies were not running the world, but a fear of hidden power absolutely helped shape politics, culture, and history itself. Fear doesn't need proof, it only needs plausibility. So welcome back to Naked History. Before we talk about any specific group, we do need to talk about language, because the phrase secret society does a remarkable amount of emotional heavy lifting. When people say secret society, they rarely mean the same thing. Sometimes they're talking about private clubs, sometimes they mean fraternal organizations, sometimes they mean revolutionary groups operating under threat, and sometimes they mean outright criminal conspiracies. Now, these are not interchangeable things, but culturally we blend them together because secrecy makes us uneasy. And here's the part that we often forget. Secrecy is not rare. It's pretty normal. We accept secrecy everywhere where it feels familiar. Fraternities and sororities use rituals, oaths, symbols, and insider language. Labor unions hold closed meetings and negotiate strategy behind those doors. Churches often preserve sacred knowledge and initiation rites and internal discipline. Professional associations gate access to credentials and networks. Political parties operate through donor lists, private negotiations, and loyalty expectations. All of these groups have the same structural ingredients people associate with secret societies. They have hierarchy, ritual, internal trust, a shared identity, and restricted access. But why do these groups feel benign while others are terrifying? The answer isn't structure, it's belonging. When an organization is culturally legible, when we understand its purpose, to see ourselves reflected in it, we call it community. When it's unfamiliar, opaque, or exclusive in ways we don't understand, we call it suspicious. Now, the fear doesn't come from secrecy itself, it comes from exclusion. Exclusion feels like unfairness, and unfairness feels like power being taken from you and used somewhere else. Now, that's the first bad equation that our brains make, saying if I don't understand how this works, someone else must, and they're probably benefiting from it. Now, that assumption is emotionally satisfying. It gives chaos a shape, it gives confusion an antagonist. And that's the soil secret society fear grows in. The Bavarian Illuminati were founded in 1776, not in revolutionary America, but in Bavaria, by a man named Adam Weishaupt. He wasn't a mystic or a puppet master, he was a professor, a legal scholar, a believer in Enlightenment ideals. His goals were not apocalyptic. His were, by modern standards, almost mundane, promoting reason, encouraging education, challenging superstition, and questioning the authority of monarchy and church structures that claimed divine right. But in 18th century Europe, those ideas were not abstract philosophy. They were dangerous. And so the Illuminati organized quietly. They used codes, they used ranks, they compartmentalized information. Not because secrecy was theatrical, but because dissent was punishable. And here's the part that conspiracy culture almost never includes. The Illuminati were not especially effective. They argued constantly internally, and they over-engineered their structure. They constantly alienated allies, and they attracted attention. And eventually, the Bavarian state noticed. By the mid-1780s, secret societies were banned outright in Bavaria. Weishaupt was removed from his position and forced into exile, and the organization collapsed. Historically speaking, that should be the end of the story. But culturally, that's when a group becomes perfect. Because once a group disappears, it can't contradict you. It can't disappoint you, it can't be boring. Boredom is the enemy of myth. So after the French Revolution, an event so complex, violent, and destabilizing that it terrified elites across Europe, people needed explanations that felt proportional to the chaos that they were witnessing. They were witnessing economic collapse, food shortages, political decay, class tensions. Now, those explanations were real, but they were messy. They required patience and context to the world that they were happening in. Now, a hidden group orchestrating everything else was cleaner. The Illuminati transformed from a short-lived Enlightenment club into a reusable villain. A template, if you will. A symbol that you could attach to any moment when society changed faster than people felt comfortable. They didn't survive history, they survived storytelling. And once a name becomes shorthand for hidden control, it never really dies. It just waits for the next moment of anxiety. Now, an organization in a similar boat are the Freemasons. Now, Freemasonry became frightening not because it vanishes like the Illuminati, but because it stayed. Unlike short-lived secret groups that burn out and disappear, Freemasonry persists across centuries, adapting quietly to changing political and social climates. It doesn't hide in the shadows, it exists openly enough to be seen, but not openly enough to be understood. And that combination, visibility without transparency, is historically volatile. Freemasonry emerges from medieval stonemason guilds, organizations built around craft knowledge, mutual protection, and identity. Over time, especially as Europe shifts away from purely guild-based economies, those literal tools of stonework became symbolic. The square, the compass, the level, no longer instruments for building cathedrals, but metaphors for building moral character, social order, and personal discipline. Now, this isn't unusual. Humans have always used metaphor in ritual to encode values. Religions do this, universities do this, militaries do this, corporations do this. The difference is that Freemasonry keeps its symbolic language internal. And that internal language becomes unsettling when members of the organization occupy visible positions of influence. Judges, politicians, business leaders, military officers, not because Freemasons secretly coordinate world events, but because they exist inside the same social reality as everyone else, except with an added layer of mutual trust and connection. This is where the fear takes hold. Because when people feel shut out of opportunity, influence starts to feel indistinguishable from conspiracy. From the outside, networks of trust start to look a lot like favoritism. Loyalty looks a lot more like protection, and success looks prearranged. Now, the uncomfortable truth history keeps forcing us to confront is that influence is real. Networks matter. Who you know has always shaped outcomes. That doesn't mean the network is omnipotent, but it doesn't have to be to feel threatening. Freemasonry becomes a mirror for social anxiety. It reflects fears about merit, fairness, and access. And when society feels stable, those fears stay muted. When society feels unequal or rigged, they erupt. And the fear isn't actually about Freemasonry. It's about power that feels unearned, unseen, and unreachable. Now, fear becomes historically dangerous when it stops being personal and starts being organized. In the early 19th century United States, suspicion of Freemasonry doesn't remain confined to sermons or editorials or even private conversation. It becomes an entire political identity. The anti-Masonic movement emerges not as a fringe curiosity, but as a legitimate political force, forming the first major third party in American history. This matters more than we usually acknowledge, because the anti-Masonic party isn't built on proof that Freemasons controlled the government. It was built on the belief that secrecy itself is incompatible with democracy. The belief is emotionally pervasive because in a young republic still negotiating what fairness, transparency, and equality are supposed to look like. Fear doesn't need to prove wrongdoing to demand action. It only needs to suggest that the rules are hidden and therefore unjust. Now, this is the moment where suspicion turns into policy, where anxiety becomes legislation, and where fear becomes respectable. And this is also a reoccurring pattern all throughout history. When institutions feel distant, when elites appear insulated from consequence, when economic and political outcomes feel unfair or inexplicable, people don't demand spreadsheets, they demand villains. Fear simplifies the world. It transforms complex systems into intentional harm. And it replaces uncertainty with certainty, even if that certainty is wrong. Once fear becomes political, it no longer asks where or whether something is true. It asks whether something feels threatening. And feelings, unlike facts, don't require consistency. And this is how secret society thinking moves from rumor to ballot. Now, here's the contradiction at the heart of all of this, and it's one that we rarely say out loud. Most organizations we trust operate with the same mechanics as the organizations that we fear. Labor unions hold closed meetings and negotiate strategy privately. Churches maintain sacred knowledge and internal discipline structures inaccessible to outsiders. Political parties conduct donor negotiations, power broking, and candidate selection behind closed doors. Corporations protect proprietary information as trade secrets, and honestly, one of the most explicit of them all is fraternities and alumni networks. They rely on ritual, loyalty, and insider access. All of these organizations share the structural DNA of secret societies, and yet they don't terrify us. Now, why is that? Well, because they are culturally legible. We understand what they claim to do, even if we don't always agree with how they do it. Their goals are visible, their language is familiar, and their legitimacy has always been socially normalized. Now, fear doesn't grow in secrecy alone, it grows in alienation. When people feel disconnected from decision making, when they believe outcomes are predetermined, and when access feels restricted except to an invisible few, imagination rushes in to fill the void. And imagination rarely chooses the most charitable explanation. This is why secret societies become convenient symbols. They provide a narrative container for resentment, frustration, and the loss of a person's agency. They allow people to point at something and say, that's why I didn't get the job. And the fear isn't about candles or handshakes. It's about not being invited into the room. Now, in the modern world, we actually don't have a need for secret societies anymore. We've built something even more efficient. Systems so complex that no single human fully understands them. Algorithms that decide what we see, financial markets that move faster than explanation, and bureaucracies operating through layers of abstraction that even insiders struggle to navigate. Power has become faceless, and humans do not tolerate faceless power well. So our brains do what they've always done, and they invent a face. Not the Illuminati and not the Freemasons, but something functionally identical. The deep state, or elites, or globalists, or they. Always they. Because they explain uncertainty. They explain loss. They explains why effort doesn't always translate into outcome. And fear spreads faster now than it ever has. Outrage towards clarity, not accuracy. Simplified villains outperform systemic explanations every time. So secret society thinking adapts. It sheds the robes and lodges and replaces them with narratives of hidden coordination, with rigged systems, with puppet masters, with invisible hands. Once fear becomes a political identity, it no longer just interprets reality, it reshapes it. People vote based on imagined enemies. Institutions lose legitimacy not because they failed, but because they're believed to be controlled. History doesn't require conspiracies to fracture trust. Belief alone is enough. Now, how does all of this work? How does it all make sense? Well, fear is one of the most efficient political tools ever discovered. It doesn't require solutions. It doesn't require policy expertise. It doesn't even require consistency. It only requires repetition. Once people believe someone is secretly cheating the system, every setback becomes confirmation. Every contradiction becomes proof of how deep the conspiracy runs. Evidence stops being something you evaluate and starts being something that you interpret. This is why conspiracy thinking is so resilient. It isn't an argument waiting to be disproven, it's an emotional ecosystem designed to protect itself. Secret societies, real, exaggerated, or entirely imagined, become anchors for that ecosystem. They give fear a shape. They give anxiety a target. They allow people to externalize frustrations rather than confront the uncomfortable truth that systems are messy, impersonal, and often unfair without any intention. And that may be the hardest idea history ever asks us to accept. That sometimes no one is in charge. Here's the naked truth. Secret societies didn't control history. Fear did. Fear of exclusion, fear of hidden rules, fear that someone else knows how the game works and you don't. The Illuminati collapsed. The Freemasons adapted, but suspicion survived. And if there's one lesson worth carrying forward, it's this. When someone offers you a story where everything wrong in the world can be traced back to a single hidden group, I need you to pause. Not because corruption doesn't exist, not because power is always honest, but because history shows us that fear loves shortcuts, and shortcuts rarely lead to the truth. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, hit follow, leave us a review, and share it with a friend who texts you links that start with, "I don't want you to know this." And I want to hear from you. What conspiracy did you believe longer than you care to admit? Send it in and we'll unpack it in the upcoming Naked History Debrief. And next time, we're going to space. Not the heroic version, the real one. We're going to be covering the tragic story of Laika the space dog, and the difference between a symbol and a life. Until then, I've been Dylan Gassaway, and this has been Naked History. Remember to stay weird, stay curious, and stay naked. Historically speaking, of course. Have a good one, and we'll see you in the next one. Good night.